I'm excited about today's topic because amending your governing documents is a topic that's very, very near and dear to my heart. I do a lot of amendments these days, and it seems to be a trending topic for many associations, many boards, many managers. So I'm glad that we're going to go through this today. There's a lot of stuff that we're going through, and so just so you know, there's a lot of stuff. And I will certainly try to answer any questions I can at the end of the program. But before we start, let's go ahead and do this housekeeping. So on the screen, you're going to see the PowerPoint presentation in the center of your screen. This should take up most of the screen. There should also be a small box on the bottom right-hand side of the screen with a video feed, i.e. presenter me. On the left side of the menu, please select the questions and answers icon and type in all your questions, which will be addressed at the end of the webinar. So we're going to go through the material, but type in the questions and they'll be addressed at the end. CMCA credits are automatically generated once the webinar hosting site provides an attendance confirmation report and will be sent via email within 48 hours following the webinar. These credits are not transferable. Please email education@altitude.law or call Sean Sanders directly at 303-991-2076 if you have any questions about receiving your CMCA certificates. Okay, so that's my little housekeeping for the day. Let's go ahead and move forward. Also, I always want to let you know about the next webinars coming up and the next two webinars actually coming up. We have one webinar on February 23rd, Board Member Basics. This is fantastic for any board member or any homeowner that's wanting to be on the board or even any ACC member. It's just good because regardless of whether you're a newbie or you've been on the board forever, it's a good refresher course, and it's also just a good touchstone so that you can know how to keep yourself out of trouble. That's what it really comes down to, is minimizing liability, yourself and the associations. So that's on February 23rd. That's Tuesday, 5:30 to 7 p.m. So make sure you get your boards to attend that one. And then also next month's webinar it's on insurance. Insurance, why do we have to keep talking about it? I don't know. We're always going to have to be talking about insurance. So that's on March 4th, and that's from noon to 1:30. Both of those webinars and the information are on our website, so www.altitude.law. So please be sure to sign up for those. They're great topics. Okay, let's get started. So what are we talking about today? Amending your governing documents. We're going to talk about the top 3 signs of when you should consider amending. We'll talk about the docs and how they work, each of them how they work for the association. We'll give specific examples of why you should be considering amending. And then we're going to talk about general amendment concerns, regardless of what document you're amending. And then finally, the amendment process itself for each of those documents and the best practices for the associations to get the document started. So that's a good amount of stuff. Again, we'll leave the questions for the end. So put your questions in the chat box as we go through, and I'll try to answer all of them at the end. And also know that this is going to be recorded, like all our webinars now, our lunch forum webinars, and it's going to be on our YouTube channel. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay. 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 Here's all your questions. Okay. Okay, thank you. I'm going to tell, and this is on right now, right? Okay. Wow, technical difficulties, and I'm not even teaching a technical class. Isn't that fun? All right, so we might go over about 10 minutes, and kudos to Sean Sanders for coming up and just getting everything started, and he did that in like less than 20 seconds, so I'm very impressed. All right, so here we go again. We're starting over again, and we already went over what we're talking about today, but the first thing I want to talk about is the top 3 signs you should consider amending. So one of those top 3 signs is one or more of your documents is more than 10 years old. So the legislature, as you probably know, has been focusing on HOAs, and that's been for the last maybe 10 years. And there seems to be a lot of legislation that is coming in and focusing on more transparency and more notice and more opportunities for homeowners to attend meetings and get records and to understand the decision-making process for the board. So if you have documents that are more than 10 years old, then a lot of times those documents are no longer in compliance with Colorado law. And what good are they if they're contrary to Colorado law? You don't want the board to follow documents that are outdated because, that'll lead to potential liability. You might be thinking, I know the documents like the back of my hand, but that doesn't really matter because if the statutes then supersede you, you're going to have an issue. So we don't want boards following documents that are more than 10 years old because they're probably out of compliance with Colorado law. Not only does this potentially lead to liability, but also it leads to unreasonable expectations in terms of homeowners. They think something's allowed because it's in the documents, or they think something's prohibited because it's in the documents. So we definitely don't want that. Okay, what else? You have consulted an attorney more than 3 times in the last year for interpretation. Now, not that I don't like lining my pockets whenever there's a legal question that comes down and around our firm. We definitely want to provide the legal advice to you and give you the interpretation. But if you've been calling your attorney quite a bit for interpretation, then that means that your documents are hard to understand. They're hard to interpret. There's questions of maybe there's a bunch of legalese, maybe they're just hard to read, or they're ambiguous, whatever it is. So why spend all that money hiring an attorney to interpret it for you when you can just hire an attorney to rewrite those governing documents and get rid of that ambiguity and make it easier to read and make it reflect your community today. And then finally, you consistently fail to meet or enforce the governing documents and what's in them. So that's obviously a question, because why aren't you enforcing them? There must be something about those documents that you don't like, maybe. Maybe it's a provision that says no dogs allowed, or maybe it's, who doesn't like dogs? Of course, why wouldn't you want to allow dogs? And you have a provision that says no dogs allowed, so you're not enforcing it because everybody has a dog. Or maybe you have provisions that really don't reflect how you practice today. So the board's kind of made a decision that, hey, we're not gonna meet that because nobody does that. The prior 10 boards have never done that. Well, that's a problem because that could lead to liability for you as a board member as well as the association. If you have clear documents, you have to enforce them. So you're in between the rock and a hard place. Either you enforce them or you consider amending to meet whatever the expectations are. So let's talk a little bit about the documents themselves. And I know a lot of you managers have been doing this for quite some time, and I know that you know the documents, but I still want to go over for newer managers as well as board members who might be on today. So the documents, you'll notice, unfortunately, it says declaration. It should say declaration/plat. I thought I'd corrected that, but I didn't. But the declaration is essentially the most important document of the association because it establishes the use restrictions, the meat of the provisions, the maintenance provisions, the assessment provisions, architectural, all these kinds of things are, really affect everybody in the community. So that's a really important document. It's recorded with the clerk and recorder's office of the county in which your property is located. And it's the only document that, even if you didn't read it, the courts are going to say you should have read it. The courts are going to say that you have constructive notice of those documents. So if somebody comes to you and says, well, I had no idea that I had to ask the Architectural Review Committee prior to me installing the 6-foot privacy fence, or I had no idea that you could levy a special assessment against me in order to pay the association's wind and hail deductible. I mean, if it's clearly stated in the documents, then the courts are going to say you had constructive notice of that, as long as that declaration was appropriately recorded in the clerk and recorder's office, according to statute. So it's important. So the next one is the Articles of Incorporation. Now on that one, it's, even though it's second in line here, all it really does is bring the association into existence, and it establishes the broad purposes of the association. I call it the birth certificate of the association. All these initial board members, initial incorporator, all the general provisions of why the association has come into existence. So it's generally only 3 or 4 pages long. It's filed with the Colorado Secretary of State's office. And the one thing I wanted to point out about the Articles of Incorporation is that every year, the Secretary of State's office will send what's called a periodic report request, which essentially just asks you some questions, like, whether you're still an association, and asks you to fill out a couple of things like the name of the association and a couple of other things. And that periodic request goes to the registered agent of the association. The registered agent is whoever is deemed to receive a summons or a lawsuit that is filed against the association. That's who's designated as the registered agent. And if you don't know who that is, you better find out. You better get on the Secretary of State's website, because that's the person that the Colorado Secretary of State is going to send this periodic request every year to. And if that person doesn't respond within 5 years, I mean, each year, cumulatively 5 years, then the Secretary of State's office could administratively dissolve you. So you don't want that to happen, because that's when you lose your lien rights, you lose your enforcement rights. Not a good thing. Typically, it's either the management company or the attorney, or if you're self-managed, maybe the board president who serves as this person. But if you don't know, you got to find out. Just get on the Secretary of State's website and search your name and find out. Bylaws. Bylaws are the operational Bible of the association. That's what I like to call them, because they're all about procedure and operations of the association. Things like, how do you hold a meeting? How do you elect directors? How do you inspect records? General voting protocol. All that good operational stuff is in the bylaws. And I'm going to say it's the most important document, excuse me, for the board, because this is the document that the board, I actually see boards mess up the most when it comes to the bylaws, because there's so many nuances. I mean, there's things like you must hold your annual meeting on May 1st at 7 p.m. when the moon is full. I mean, it's that specific. They're all drafted differently, and if you don't follow the specific requirements, then that's where the boards could get in trouble. But bylaws are operational. And then finally, the rules, regs, guidelines, and policies. All of these docs really just supplement and clarify the top 3 that I just discussed. So if you have a declaration provision that says you can have a reasonable number of household pets, then the rules will say household pet means dog, cat, chicken, cow, whatever. And reasonable number means 2 per unit. So that's where you clarify it and you define it in the rules and regs. Same thing with the guidelines. Those are for architectural requests. Maybe it says fences are allowed subject to ACC guidelines. Your guidelines will say fences must be no taller than 6 feet, only privacy, only this material, and blah, blah, blah. And then finally, the policies. Those are really just memorializations of board actions in certain things, such as collections. If you have a lot of delinquent assessments, you adopt a policy that clarifies and memorializes how the board is going to collect those assessments. How many days till you get a late fee? When do the liens get filed? What kind of payment plan terms are going to be in place? That's all in the policies and procedures. So the one thing I didn't mention, and it's not on here again, is the plat. That should be on the first bullet point. So just write that into your material. And the plat is, or the condominium map if you're a condo, is recorded with the declaration at the same time, roughly around the same time, sometimes the same day, sometimes within a couple days, a couple months of each other. But they're recorded together in order to create the property. And the plat essentially lists all the property that is subject to that declaration and is part of your community. It's important, if you've never seen your plat, to get a copy, because you could find some ways or some information on those plats that will help you as an association. For example, if you had no idea who maintained the balconies, the plat or the condominium map might actually say, these are limited common elements that are maintained by the owner. So just get your map, get your plat if you haven't gotten it. It's available at the clerk and recorder's office. And it's also, again, in the county clerk and recorder's office in the county in which your property is located. All right, let's move on. So general reasons you should consider amending. These are all just things, a summary of things that you should be considering and why you should be considering amending. And I'm going to go through examples of each one of them here. Next. So that was an easy, quick slide. All right, provisions not current with the law. This is probably the #1 reason why boards and managers come to me to amend their documents, because they start realizing, wow, we are missing something, or this is contrary, I think, to what Colorado law says. And when I say not current with law, what I'm talking about is Kiowa. That's one of the statutes. The Colorado Common Interest Ownership Act, Kiowa. So that's one of the laws, state law. The nonprofit, the Colorado Revised Nonprofit Corporation Act, the Colorado Revised Nonprofit Corporation Act. That's also called the Nonprofit Act for short. Those are the two state laws that we are typically looking at whenever we're amending the documents and figuring out which ones need to be updated. And sometimes federal law will come into place as well. And I've got one federal law example here that I'll talk about in a second. So declaration, let's talk about, and these are just a few examples that I pulled out that typically come up in most every set of documents that I see if they're more than 10 years old. There's a virtual cornucopia of other, treasure trove of other examples where Colorado law or federal law is going to supersede your governing documents. And again, you need to have your documents comply, or you're following a bad set of documents, thinking you're doing a great job and actually breaking the law. So, all right. So political signs. I think that a lot of people are probably sick of hearing about political signs, but most documents, most declarations say that signs, only certain signs are allowed. Usually they say something like for sale or for rent signs are allowed. So you should know, hopefully, that Kiowa says you can't ban political signs. And there's some restrictions around that and clarifications around that, but you can't ban political signs from the owner's unit or lot boundaries. And if you're in a condo, in the windows. You can regulate the size, number, and display per statute, but you can't ban them. So that's probably one major example that I see in many documents that is contrary to state law. Satellite dishes. This is another one that's been going on forever, and this is actually a federal law, the over-the-air reception device law. We have fantastic articles on our website if you ever want to go and do a deep dive into each of these topics, but we have a great one on solar panels and satellite dishes, so get on our website if you're more interested in about this. But most declarations say that you can't install a satellite dish without approval. I'd say probably 95% of the declarations say that. But certain satellite dishes are protected under federal law, those that are 39 inches and or those that are 1 meter in diameter or less, which I think is 39 inches. But 1 meter in diameter or less, they are protected by federal law. So the requirement of prior approval before you install that satellite dish within your unit or property that you have exclusive use over, that requirement is seen by federal law as an unreasonable delay on the owner's right to install a satellite dish. So I bet you didn't know that. You've probably been requesting all the homeowners to give you, to submit an architectural review request to install that satellite dish. You can't do that if it's one of the protected ones. And again, I'm just skimming the surface here. You can require notification of intention to install a satellite dish, but you just can't require that prior approval. So check out the article on our website for more about that, because there's a lot more about satellite dishes. But just know, can't ban them, and you can't enforce that restriction that says you need prior approval. Finally, budget veto process. That's another example that came up a couple of years ago when the law was changed. Now, most associations, well, not most, associations that have been created on or after July 1st, 1992 are called post-Kiowa associations, and they've already been required to follow this budget veto process, which is essentially a process where you submit the budget to the owners for an opportunity to veto. So they get to consider it, and then they get an opportunity to veto that. So post-Kiowa associations, which again, on or after July 1992, are subject to this process. But the law changed a couple of years ago to apply this veto process to pre-Kiowa associations, which are those that were created prior to July 1st, 1992. So if you didn't know that, then typically with pre-Kiowa associations, the board can just adopt the budget themselves and then just go ahead and say, okay, here's what you owe for next year. But now pre-Kiowa associations also have to provide that budget for an opportunity to veto by the owners. There's only one exception, and that's if the declaration already has some kind of cap on the amount of assessments, so you can't go over that cap without getting owner approval, but that's a limited exception. A lot of pre-Kiowa associations have no idea that they have to go through the budget veto process now unless they fall under that exception, and they should know it. So bylaws, I'm going to put all three of these in here. Notice requirements. One example would be that a lot of the old bylaws say that you can give notice up to 60 days prior to the meeting of the owners. That's capped now to 50 days. A lot of the bylaws don't say that you have to physically post notice of the owners meeting somewhere conspicuously in the community prior to that owner meeting. If you don't know that because you don't have your bylaws updated, well, then you're missing out on a particular provision you're supposed to follow. Secret ballots. Right now, what the law says is any contested elections have to be conducted by secret ballot. Most documents don't say anything about contested elections, or some of them actually say all elections have to be conducted by secret ballot. So why would you want that limitation in there? So that's one of the bylaws provisions. Missing provisions. Many of the bylaws don't contain these new requirements under Kiowa, things like prior to taking action at a board meeting, you have to allow a reasonable number of homeowners to speak for or against whatever you're about to vote on. A lot of boards don't know that. A lot of boards don't know that ballots, all of them, not just secret ballots, but all ballots have to be counted by a neutral third party. That law was passed several years ago. Many boards don't know that while you can go into executive session, maybe to speak to your attorney about rules and regulations you're about to approve, you can't approve those rules and regulations in an executive session. You can't approve amendments, articles, and bylaws in your executive session. That's something that you wouldn't know unless it's in your documents, because most documents don't contain that requirement. Those changes were made just maybe 5 or 6 years ago. So just keep in mind, that's one of the main reasons why you should be considering amending if you're following a bad set of documents. Okay, no limitations and no flexibility. These are things that are just not allowing you to work in an effective and or an efficient manner. So in the declaration, we've got caps on assessments. Sometimes they'll see a document that says you can't raise assessments more than 5% of over what it was last year's budget amount without getting 67% of the homeowners to approve. That's very difficult to get that approval, and that cap doesn't take into consideration things like inflation and other costs that increase every year. So it's not a good one. Late fees. If you have a late fee that says for every assessment you don't pay, you get charged a $5 late fee. Yeah, that's not really going to incentivize anybody to come current on their dues. Fines of no more than $25 of a fine, like a cap on fines of $25. If you have an RV that's parked on a driveway in violation of the documents, and you tell that person, I'm going to fine you $25 unless you move that RV. Well, they're going to say, here's my $25 because it's going to cost a lot more for me to get offsite storage than to pay your $25 fine. So it just doesn't do what it's supposed to do for you. No supplemental assessment authority. That's really language that allows you to assess less than all units if either less than all units are benefited by a certain expense. So let's say you have 6 condo buildings and only one of those buildings has balconies. Don't you want to be able to charge only that building with balconies for those balcony repairs? Well, a lot of declarations require you to spread that cost over the entire community unless you have that supplemental assessment authority. So you'd want that in there. Registered or certified mail, some of the documents will say something like, you need to have snail mail and use snail mail. And not only snail mail, it has to be registered or certified for every single notice or every single demand or every single non-routine letter. That could be a problem in itself. So you would rather have just a mailed requirement, and you should want the flexibility of things like email or other kinds of notices for those non-meeting notices or non-important notices, more of those community-wide e-blasts, for example. So you don't want to have that limitation in your declaration. But if it's there, you got to follow it. Bylaws, annual meetings, like I gave the example before, sometimes it's very strict as to time, date, where. I had one association in Boulder where, of course it's Boulder, sorry Boulder, but it said something like, the annual meeting is on June 1st at 7 p.m. under the council tree. And what the heck is a council tree? And I had a board that was really frustrated and nervous about that because they were already getting, walloped for other types of violations. So they were saying, do I create a sign that says council tree and then put it under one of the trees in the community? I'm like, no, amend that language out. You don't need the council tree. So quorum, if you have quorum and you have a large association and you have a 50% quorum, that's going to be really, really, really hard to meet. And you can't do anything. You can't take action in the annual meeting if you can't meet quorum. The only action that you can take, and this is prescribed under Kiowa, is budget ratification, the opportunity to pass that budget. So you need to, I know that that's sort of, the vicious circle. If you can't get quorum to attend the meeting, how are you going to get quorum to vote on that document to reduce the quorum? Well, we'll talk about best practices for amending here in a second, but you can do it. I have done it. I have had associations that had 50% quorum in like a 300 unit community, and they were able to do it. Unanimous approval for board action taken by email. A lot of boards are, I'm not a big fan of taking action by board email unless it's an exception because of maybe circumstances or emergencies or something, because you don't really have that face-to-face interaction. I'd rather you meet in person, or not now, but meet via Zoom so you can get that sort of discussion going in face-to-face. But if you're going to if you're going to take action by email, Colorado law defers to the action without a meeting provision in your bylaws. So Colorado law says if you want to take action without a meeting, i.e. via email, then follow your bylaws. And so many bylaws say in order to take action without a meeting as a board, you have to get unanimous approval. And that means all unanimous approval. So Colorado law is not as strict as that. And why not take advantage of Colorado law and allow for a majority of the directors in office to vote in favor of the document? So again, these were limitations and no flexibility in your documents. All right. And again, I'm just giving you some examples. There's tens of zillions more examples out there. And maybe we'll do this again. We sent out this document several years ago when we said, look, you pay us 10 cents and we'll find 10 things wrong with your documents. And believe me, I found 20 things wrong. So you can pay me 20 cents and I'll give you 20 things wrong with your documents if they're over 10 years old. because believe me, there's a lot of things missing or wrong. So inconsistent provisions. This document is what I call the hierarchy of authority. And it establishes, what it means is, to the extent that any documents amongst these listed here that are, to the extent that there's any inconsistency between and among these documents, then the higher one is going to control. So if there's something between the bylaws and the declaration, then the declaration is going to control because it's higher on this list. Rules and articles, then the articles is going to supersede. Just always look at that. And many documents that are older have inconsistency between and amongst the documents. One says one thing, another says another thing. So look at this chart for those issues. But why not amend to make the documents really work with one another and be consistent with one another, so you don't have to keep going back to this chart saying, I don't know which one controls, which one supersedes. I want to give you 2 examples of when I typically see an inconsistency. The first one is with the bylaws and the articles. And you'll see here the bylaws are lower than the articles. So to the extent of any inconsistency, the articles are going to control. So where I usually see an issue is number of directors on the board. And many people, when they're looking for what number of directors they're allowed to have on the board, they look at the bylaws because, again, that's the operational Bible. That's where you usually look for anything that has to do with directors. So sometimes the bylaws will say something like, there shall be 5 directors, for example. But every association should also look at the articles of incorporation, because oftentimes the articles also establish a specific number of directors. And many times I've found that the articles say you can have 3 directors and that's all. But you have bylaws that say you can have 5. So to the extent of any inconsistency, the articles are in control. So you're going to have to reduce that to 3 unless you make those documents consistent. So that's one pretty typical example. Another example sometimes is rules versus declaration. Rules is at the very bottom, declaration is near the top, and boards will adopt this list of rules on pets, parking, pools, and all that good stuff, and they won't look at the declaration. So the declaration might say something like, or the rules might say something like, no dogs allowed, and the declaration will say a reasonable number of dogs are allowed. So obviously the declaration is going to control, but you need to have somebody take a look at that to make sure that it is consistent with all the other governing documents. I see rules all the time that are contrary to the declaration. So just realize it's definitely an issue. One last one probably is declaration versus statute. There's been so many changes in Kiowa over 10 years that boards didn't realize that the clear language of the declaration is now superseded by Kiowa or some other Colorado law. An example would be solar panels. State law says solar panels must be allowed on property you own. Declaration might say no solar panels. Or another one is declarations might say something like no evaporative coolers. That's another one. They're required by state law as well, required to be allowed, so you can't ban evaporative coolers. Another one might be, what was I thinking about that one? State law, solar panels. Oh, I'm blanking on another example, but there's tons. There's the American flag one, there's the military flag one, there's clotheslines, restricting clotheslines. So there's a ton of things out there that might be contrary to state law that boards don't know. And again, to the extent of any inconsistency, the higher one's going to control, and you'll see that the statute was higher. All right, ambiguous, difficult to interpret. So I just gave you some examples right there. What's a commercial vehicle? Is that a cement truck, or is that a little pink Cadillac with a tiny Mary Kay sticker on it? She's selling Mary Kay cosmetics, so is it a commercial vehicle? What do you mean by screaming from you? Does that mean I can't see it with a naked eye? Does that mean the neighbor can't see it? Does that mean that somebody can't see it from the public street? Does that mean screened by a fence, screened by landscaping? What does that mean? What does exterior surface mean? Does that mean the siding only, or does that include more? How deep into the structure does that mean? So it's ambiguous and it's hard to interpret and therefore hard to enforce. And boards will certainly try to define that, but you never know what's going to happen down the line with future boards and that interpretation. Maintenance and insurance provisions probably is the number one thing that is difficult to interpret. If it says that you're responsible as an owner for your perimeter walls and floors and ceilings, where does that start? Does that start at the paint? Does that start at the drywall? Does that start at the studs? I don't know. Do you? I mean, if it's ambiguous in your documents, then how are you supposed to then enforce and ensure that owners are maintaining their property appropriately? Insurance, I don't even want to talk about insurance. Insurance is confusing no matter what, but sign on to our insurance webinar that's coming up next month. I think I said March 4th. So, and then finally, gaps, undesirable provisions, and obsolete provisions. Short-term rentals is probably the Airbnbs, VRBOs, is probably the number one thing that we get requested to amend these days, because it's just something that's either people really, they want to prohibit it or they want to allow it. So I am seeing some that are saying, look, we're going to embrace this, embrace the fact that people want to monetize their units just like Uber and just like whatever. And so we want to allow them, but we also want our cut. And so we want to put in an assessment for Airbnbs. So, hey, you want to amend to include it? We can amend to include it. Smoking and marijuana is a trend, prohibiting marijuana grows and marijuana use and the straight-on resources and all that. No pets, no dogs allowed. That's usually one that people want to remove because, it doesn't meet what the community wants these days. Maintenance provisions don't reflect practice. That's a big one. Because just recently I've been seeing a lot of associations where they have documents that say, association is required to maintain all the balconies. And then it turns out after 10 years, their attorney takes one look at it and says, no, owners are supposed to maintain their balconies. So what do you do about those 10 years that the association has been maintaining those balconies, or vice versa? What if you've been having the owners maintain those balconies and then somebody says, no, 10 years later, the association is supposed to be maintaining them? Are you going to now say, oh, oops, sorry, now we're going to switch it? And I mean, many associations, what they'll do is they'll amend to keep with those expectations. They'll amend to correct what has happened in the past so that they can keep with homeowner expectations and keep moving forward with everybody still happy. So that's a big one. COVID related, the ones I wanted to say about COVID related, I mean, one of the things that I see often in bylaws and articles of incorporation are provisions that say that the association's purpose, one of the purposes, is to advance and protect the health and the safety of the residents and owners in the community. So that never, I don't think anybody, when they drafted those articles, was thinking about things like a pandemic or a virus or anything like that. But because of that language, it implies this argument, or it doesn't imply it, but it creates it. It creates this an argument that the association has a duty to keep you safe and disease-free, and to do more than really you ought to be doing as an association. So that's one of the things that we've considered striking if you're amending your documents. The other thing too is virtual meetings. A lot of documents don't specifically discuss virtual meetings and allowing people to participate. So one of the amendments you might want to use or consider is clarifying that owners and boards can meet totally through virtual platforms. So that's another thing. There's going to be a lot of legislation. This is a big legislation year. So there's probably more that should be incorporated into that. But you should be considering amending this year. It is the year to do it. Okay, and then finally, declarant rights. That's more about being obsolete. If you no longer have a declarant or developer in the picture, and any other things that are obsolete. I saw terms. What did I see? Still terms like you can send notice by telegraph. No. And I mean, even a fax, but I know that still people use faxes. But you might want to get rid of some of that archaic language and obsolete language. All right, so I got through all the specific examples of types of things that you want to consider amending. And again, those are just a small list of examples. Now let's talk about the general amendment considerations. And this is in terms of, it doesn't matter what you're amending, just things to think about. So for example, a resolution or an amendment. So do you really need to amend that document, or can you just adopt a resolution, which again is like a policy? A resolution is a memorialization of a board's decision. So the board resolves to define household pets as dog, cat, chicken. So it's a memorialization of a board interpretation or a board action or a board definition. So when it comes to ambiguous provisions in the declaration, for example, like household pet, the courts are going to allow boards to adopt reasonable interpretations of those ambiguous provisions. The problem is that your reasonable interpretation might not be the same as another board 10 years from now, who might overturn that decision or that interpretation in favor of their own. So if you want something to stick, then I would say amend and put that language into the declaration versus adopting a resolution defining that ambiguous term. Limited amendment or full rewrite. A lot of questions we get are, it costs so much to rewrite the documents, we just can't move forward. Well, maybe you don't even need to do a full rewrite. Maybe you just need to do piecemeal amendments to address the issues that are really critical for your association, and then you budget for a rewrite later on down the line. Consider that there are different approval requirements depending on the document. Some will require owner versus board approval. You might actually need lender approval, and that's for the declaration. Sometimes I've seen it for the bylaws, which is scary. And then there's also statutory requirements, and we're going to talk about these in the next couple slides here. Also, there's different approval processes for obtaining the approval of the document. And you need to look, these are all document specific. So some might say you shall get these amended at a meeting, or you shall you have the ability to get written consent, which allows other types of options for amending. All right, so let's talk about the specific amendment requirements for each document, starting with the articles. So the articles, again, it's on that hierarchy. It's kind of high up there, but it's probably the least important when it comes to having to amend, because typically there's really not too many inconsistencies with either governing documents or state law when it comes to the articles. But if you're going to amend, then look to the document. It'll typically tell you what the amendment requirement is. There are, if there's no amendment requirement, then the board is allowed to amend the articles for certain limited types of things under this provision. Things like deleting the names and addresses of the original directors or the original incorporator, or changing the registered agent's name or address or the principal office. Those things are things that the board can do. But typically the articles are not silent, and typically it's owner approval. And I usually see something like a majority of a quorum have to approve, or sometimes 67% of a quorum have to approve. But if it is silent, then it's a majority of at least a quorum of the owners. And that's per the nonprofit code. Okay, so I just want to go over that really quickly, and let's get to some of the meatier documents here. All right, so amending the bylaws. Top question I usually get is the board empowered to amend the bylaws without homeowner approval? Because again, this is the operational document, so why not allow the boards to amend it on their own? So let's say that it's silent and the bylaws don't say anything, because the bylaws will typically have an amendment requirement, but let's say it's silent for now. Boards, if it's silent, then boards that are part of a pre-Kiowa association, again, association that's created prior to July 1st, 1992. Those boards can amend the bylaws on their own, which means without homeowner approval, except for quorum. And that's the citation here that allows them to amend it on their own, this citation, these two citations, but they cannot amend quorum. So for post-Kiowa associations, boards can amend on their own, except for quorum, terms and qualifications of directors and powers and duties of the board. And here's the Kiowa section that limits the board's authority. So the board might be able to approve on its own without homeowner approval, and it'll depend on whether it's a pre-Kiowa or post-Kiowa association, the extent that they are able to amend on their own. But there's an exception that applies to both pre- and post-Kiowa associations, and that's if the bylaws themselves expressly prohibit the board from amending the bylaws. And, I've seen many bylaws that say the board shall not amend the bylaws. If you have that, then, game over. You can't use pre-Kiowa, those sections here, or post-Kiowa. It doesn't matter what you are. You cannot amend as a board. Others will say the bylaws shall be amended by the owners, only the owners. So that implies, even though it doesn't expressly say it, but I would say if it says only the owners can amend the bylaws, then the board can't amend the bylaws. But again, there's a great flexibility. And so if you're not sure, talk to your attorney, they can show you. But most of the time they do require, most of the time they say the owners may amend the bylaws. That's not an express prohibition against the board amending the bylaws. So if they say the owners may amend the bylaws, then to me, that means the owners may amend it and so can the board. And depending on whether you're pre-Kiowa or post-Kiowa, you're limited in how you can amend that. But also look for different types of owner approval. It's document specific. It might be majority of a quorum. It might be 75% of the entire community, but it's all document specific. Okay, so finally we're at the declaration, amending the declaration. So first of all, you should remember that no matter what your documents say, what your declaration says, Kiowa requires the owners to approve it. There's very limited exceptions to that, and they're all in the same section of Kiowa, those exceptions. That's 38-33.3-217. So all the exceptions are in that section of Kiowa, but for the most part, owner approval only. And what Kiowa says is no less than a majority of the entire community, not a majority of a quorum, but a majority of the entire community, and no more than 67%. So that's the range within which owners must approve a declaration amendment. So if you have a declaration that says 75% of the entire community must approve it, we'll read that declaration to say 67% as a cap. And we'll talk about exceptions here in a second, but 67% is a statutory cap. So there are exceptions for limited types of amendments, which we won't go into, things that the declarant can do, for example, and specific types of amendments. But the one I wanted to point out, the exceptions that sometimes come into play are the one about subsection 4 here, which is no amendment may create or increase special declarant rights, increase the number of units, change boundaries of any units, or change the allocated interest of any unit without at least 67%. And so that's important because some documents will say 75% for the entire declaration. Now, for the most part, it's going to be read down to 67% unless you're trying to amend for those provisions I just named. And again, that's in Kiowa. And if you don't have a copy of Kiowa, then just download it from our website, and then you can navigate to this section and you'll see section 4 that specifies those exceptions. The other one is 4.5. And this has to do with a change in the uses to which any unit is restricted. So again, it's the same kind of language as in section 4, which is you have to have at least 67% in order to make an amendment that changes the use to which any unit is restricted. Now that's up for debate what that means. I mean, I've seen different interpretations. There's no case law at this point, Colorado case law that specifies that. It could mean changing the overall use of the unit, such as from commercial to residential. It could mean changes that were expressly allowed in the unit but are now being taken away, such as leasing. Like if you had something that said leasing is allowed and now you're taking it away. Some have interpreted it to apply to any kind of change in any activity in the unit or behavior in the unit, such as if you're amending to restrict dogs in the unit, for example. So at this point, there's no Colorado Court of Appeals law or anything that applies to that, but we always try to be a little, to exercise extreme prudence in this and caution, try to get the higher percentage, So if you're not sure, just talk to your attorney and they can work, discuss that particular provision and whether it's applicable to your type of amendment. And then also there's processes for the owner approval. When it comes to owner approval, you can vote at a meeting, you can vote by mail. Some documents say you can get consent of the owner, which is just a form that says I consent as an owner. So you need to look at your documents to see what the specific approval process is and use that process. So for vote at a meeting, the only thing I wanted to mention, and when I say meeting, I mean both in-person meeting as well as a virtual, or homeowners participating through some kind of virtual or conference call or something like that. But that's still a meeting when you're meeting in person. It's either in person or virtually. What I wanted to mention in that is that if you're amending, then you need to make sure that your notice for that meeting meets the requirements of Kiowa here and says very clearly that at this meeting, we are going to vote on this amendment. If it's not in that notice and the notice isn't sent appropriately, then it's subject to challenge, because you're supposed to have that in there, and maybe homeowners might have attended that meeting if they knew that you were going to amend the declaration. Vote by mail is very specific. It's actually vote by written ballot. This is a nonprofit code process, and it's very specific in terms of what you have to do in order to vote by mail. You have to have specific language on the cover letter. You have to state the number of units that would be required to meet quorum for this meeting, even though it's not a meeting. But if you were having a meeting, what's the quorum? You have to put the actual number, not the percentage. If your quorum is 20%, you can't say 20% in the cover letter. The cover letter has to say, 20 owners out of 100 units have to respond to this mail vote by casting a ballot in order to meet quorum for this mail vote. So that's one thing. Another thing you have to include is a date and time. So that's key, time as well, by when the ballots have to be returned. So you have to say 5 p.m., for example, or 6 p.m., or whatever you want to put in there. You have to include enough information for the homeowner to make an informed decision on that document. So that's another thing. The ballot itself has to include specific requirement per the statute. So if I'm not making this clear, that you need to have your attorney draft that written ballot and that solicitation for written ballot votes for you, because or have your attorney review your documents, because you have to comply with the nuances of the nonprofit code. So finally, there's also sort of this is not the last resort, that's the court position. This is unfortunately an additional requirement often for amending the declaration, particularly with condos. Sometimes it'll require not just owner approval, but also lender or mortgagee approval. So and it's different for each document. Some might say only eligible mortgagees have to approve. And that might significantly limit, if not eliminate, mortgagee approval, because a lot of mortgagees are not deemed eligible under the definition of eligible mortgagee in the declaration. So talk to your attorney about that. If you're worried about a mortgagee approval process, I don't want you thinking we can't ever do this because we have to get lender approval and they don't respond, so we're not going to move forward. No, talk to your attorney. Also, if it's not eligible and it is a real mortgagee approval, sometimes it's unanimous mortgagee approval, sometimes it's 50%, whatever it is, then there is a process where it makes it a lot easier for you. The legislature realized that a lot of lenders don't respond, so they didn't want to tie the association's hands in amending the declaration because of lenders who don't care about the particular amendment and don't respond to the proposed amendment. So what we have under Kiowa is a certified mortgagee approval process, where essentially you just have to meet these requirements, send the notice of amendment by certified mail to each mortgagee, attach a copy of the amendment, post a notice of that amendment in a newspaper 2 times, at least 1 week apart. And then if no objection is made within 60 days from that lender, then it's deemed a yes. So that's where your apathy actually works in your favor. This does not apply to owners. You can't say, oh, if they don't respond in 60 days, it's a yes. No, this only applies to mortgagees. And you also have to remember that the declaration might actually prescribe an easier process. The declaration might actually say only 30 days you have to wait, or you only have to post in the newspaper once. So if you have an easier process in your declaration, then you just have to approve that, use that process. Amending the declaration, here's the last resort, court petition process. So this is essentially if you can't get homeowner approval for your declaration amendment, it's only applicable to declaration amendments, then you can use the court petition process, where essentially you go to court and you create a petition and you submit it, there's a hearing, and everything is actually right here. What do you need to do? You need to show that you tried. You sent at least 2 notices of amendment to the community. You had at least 1 meeting. You were able to get at least half of the required owner approval under the declaration. So you met all these things, but you were not able to get it passed because of apathy. I'm going to say apathy and not objection. And why? Because if you have more than 33% of the owners objecting to that amendment, then you've just spent a lot of money going to court for nothing. So this is what's going to happen. You meet all those requirements, we put it in a petition, we put all the paperwork together, we go to court, and the court's just going to go down and the requirements and check whether you met all those requirements. However, if more than 33% of the homeowners object to that petition, then they can't grant it. The court can't grant it. So that's why you want to know that the reason why you're going to the court petition through this process is because people are apathetic, not because they are objecting. Also, you can't use it to change the allocated interest or to terminate the association. So we talked about that earlier, about allocated interest as needing a higher requirement oftentimes. And what I mean by changing the allocated interest is, for example, if every unit owner is required, is given 1 vote per unit, and then you want to change that voting allocated interest to the unit has a weighted vote according to square footage, that's a change in the interest, the voting interest of the owner. So that's an example. But you can't use the court petition for that amendment. And no more than 33% objection by owners or mortgagees. So again, there's that mortgagee approval requirement. If it's required and you can't get owners to approve, you might as well just wrap it into the court petition process. And no declarant can object either. So you need to look at whether there's still a declarant approval requirement before you go to court for the court petition process. And all of that, your attorney can kind of go through the process with you and let you know. All right, final document, rules, regs, and guidelines. Typically the board amends the rules, regs, and guidelines, or I'm sorry, the rules and the policies. Typically the board does this unilaterally without homeowner approval. It's very rare that I see the documents actually require homeowners to approve it, but that's the typical thing. Architectural guidelines, I wanted to point out that this is document specific because some documents say that the Architectural Review Committee is required to approve it, those guidelines. And others say that the board is required to approve them. Some say that the ACC is required to submit recommendations to the board and then the board approves them, or the other way around. The board is supposed to recommend ACC guidelines to the ACC and the Architectural Control Committee then approves them. So it's all document specific. Just realize when you're amending the rules, guidelines, policies, and procedures that you are, whatever you're adopting is subject to stricter scrutiny by the court. They're going to weigh it heavier than an amendment to the declaration because they know that the declaration amendments are approved by the homeowners. So great, you went through the process, you got 67% or whatever to approve it. They're happy with that. But with rules, since the board approves them, they're going to look at them for, are they fair? Are they inconsistent with the other documents? Are they overbroad? Are they ambiguous? They're going to look, did you give homeowners notice, actual notice? Remember declaration, you have constructive notice. As long as it's recorded, then you're deemed to have read it. Not so with rules. You have to show that you provided the notice to the homeowners before you start enforcing. So it's really imperative that you have your attorney review and kind of guide you through that process. And finally, you need to follow your policy on adopting rules, regulations, and procedures. This is one of those 9 SB 100 policies. For those of you who remember SB 100, Colorado law requires you to adopt 9 policies that memorialize certain actions of the association, such as collections, enforcement, and one of those is how to adopt rules and regulations and policies. So if you have one of those in place, which you should, then follow that when you are amending rules and regulations. Finally, best practices for getting approval. Make a wish list. Don't go into this. If you're rewriting the documents, you really need to sit down and don't just talk with the board, but talk with form a document amendment committee. Get other homeowners within the community that are interested onto that committee, so that it makes it a lot easier when you're actually at the formal approval process to get that document approved, because it's not only the board that's approving it, but you have several homeowners who are also backing it as well. And it's not all on the board's shoulders. It's not all thought of as, oh, the board's just trying to increase its power. No, it's not. And so it's really good to sit down and make a wish list, talk to your attorney, say, this is what we want, and we'll tell you whether you can do it or not. Get homeowners to be there at the beginning of the process in a committee to assist you going through the process and help you in the formal process when you're trying to get approval. Don't just go straight to formal approval once you're happy with the drafts that your attorney has prepared, because you want to give homeowners the opportunity to provide input and feedback to that draft, because it's the perfect time to weed out any red flags. I mean, you might have spent months getting to a draft that you loved, and then you go to approval, and all of a sudden everybody hates it because of one provision, like the prohibition against Airbnbs. You don't want that to happen. So providing input and feedback, an input and feedback period, maybe 2 or 3 weeks prior to formal approval, you're going to weed out and find out whether any provision or provisions threaten to make the entire project fail. And then you can make a decision to either remove them or revise them so that everybody's happy. So you post on your website, email it to everybody, have informational meetings so you give them the opportunity to ask those questions and provide feedback. And then finally, make it very easy for them to vote. It's hard enough, I know it's hard, and at the end you really want to just get through the process and send out that ballot, and then you don't want to think about it again. You just want to collect those ballots. But if you could make it easier for them to return those ballots, or to attend the meeting, or whatever it is, just do it, because that's going to help tremendously. Homeowners have a lot of things to think about already without having to slog through some of these documents, and then also getting an envelope that doesn't have a stamp on it, for example, or getting something that says, please return this, but you don't include a self-addressed stamped envelope. It's going to make it a lot harder for them to return that ballot. Make it easy. Spend a little bit of money to put that self-addressed stamped envelope in there. Allow them to scan and email the ballot. Allow them to fax it. Allow them to drop it off at the management company. Try to put maybe a Dropbox somewhere within the clubhouse. Whatever it is, make it easy for them to vote. Okay, I'm 5 minutes over now. Thank you. Sorry for the technical difficulties at the beginning of this class. We had a lot of things to say, or I had a lot of things to say, and thank you again, Sean, for fixing that so quickly. So let's go ahead and look at your questions. So this document cleanup is a lot of work. The board is comprised of unpaid volunteers. Well, yes, and I think that's one of the reasons why you want to have a lot of homeowners on a committee to assist you with this. And a good law firm is going to do a lot of the heavy lifting for you. I mean, really, like, for example, our law firm, there's a process where we really seek all the questions and really get you thinking about what you should be thinking about in terms of rewriting the documents. And then we do the crafting. We solve those issues where the board is at an impasse on whether or not to allow Airbnbs. Or we solve the problem when a particular provision is not crafted as clearly as it could be crafted. Yes, it's a lot of work, but when you think about the end product, it is so much better for your association. And think about all the headaches you've had for the last 10 years trying to read documents that don't make any sense, or paying attorneys to interpret all those documents. If we want to make multiple changes to the documents at one time, can we have one vote on that entire document, group of amendments. What if, sorry, trying to read the whole thing. If we want to make multiple changes to the document at one time, can we have one vote on the entire group of amendments? What if the homeowners get hung up on one of those items? Does that negate the entire voting process? Well, yeah, if you don't know ahead of time whether homeowners don't like a particular provision, like I said in that last slide, it might jeopardize the entire project. So you want to know that ahead of time, which is why you want the input and feedback. If you want to make a bunch of changes at one time, you can have one vote on the entire group of documents. What we typically do is have one vote on the entire declaration, one vote on the entire bylaws, one vote on the entire articles. But you can also do one shebang and say all of them at once, either yes or no on all three. That might have problems because, again, the declaration is a lot harder to get approval. And so, you know, if you're doing it a one-shot deal, then you're incorporating that higher approval for the amendment process. So talk to your attorney about whether it makes sense to do that, but definitely group them all together as one vote per document, per declaration, bylaws, or articles. When writing declarations requiring owner versus HOA maintenance responsibilities, do you seek counsel with plumbers, electricians, HVAC experts to determine what is common and what would be considered a limited common element? So what is common, yeah, you can certainly talk to experts to figure out what's common in terms of best maintenance or standard practices if you wanted to include those specific standard requirements in your documents themselves. Oftentimes you can have a side document that clarifies the main provision in your declaration, and that side document, such as here are our maintenance standards, here is our water leak policies, here are the things that you need to do as a homeowner to appropriately maintain the French drain or whatever is in your balcony. That is something that we typically recommend in a side policy versus in the declaration itself. But you can certainly consult with experts to address specific items that you want in your declaration. But as far as what would be considered a common and a limited common element, that's actually per your documents already. You have to look at either your declaration or your condominium map or your plat to determine what's considered a common versus limited common elements. And although you may amend to make something a limited common element, that's more of a discussion with your attorney. What is the best source of laws regarding EV charging stations? We've been working on the premise that we can't say no, but the owner needs to cover all of the costs related to installation. The best source of law is actually the best, and this is, let's see, Steve, the best, we have a fantastic article on our website. It's all about EV charging stations, and it provides you the specific citations to the relevant provisions in the statute that cover what you can or cannot do when it comes to EV charging stations. So feel free to email me and I can get you that after this class. But it's a comprehensive article and it has everything you need. Statutes take precedence over declaration, but what about where the declaration provision is more specific, more restrictive than the statute? And does this concept apply to county codes? Great question. So statute takes precedence over declaration, but the statute doesn't necessarily, to the extent of any inconsistency. So if the statute says something like marijuana, recreational marijuana is allowed. You as an association can be stricter in your documents. You can say, understanding that the state law allows marijuana for recreational use, you can be stricter in your private declaration. And so, and the same concept applies with county codes. So if a county code says chickens are allowed, you can put in your declaration, chickens are prohibited. The only exception is if the county or the state actually calls out the association or the inability to enforce any restrictions otherwise. So for example, if the county ordinance says chickens are allowed and no entity, corporation, association, whatever, can enforce any restriction otherwise, that's different because now it is applying to your restriction. But if it doesn't have that specificity in it, then you can be stricter in your documents. Decks and bylaws are almost 40 years old. Where to begin? Call me. That's where you begin. Is it correct to amend the covenants and remove all references to ARC and put them into exhibits at the end? So exhibits at the end of the covenants are still part of the covenants. I think that's a myth that goes around that if it's an exhibit, then it's not part of the covenants. No, everything that's recorded as part of the covenants, which is the body of the covenants, and any exhibit is part of those covenants, part of those CC&Rs. And yes, I think it's appropriate to have exhibits for maintenance and insurance, for example, attached as an exhibit, because it just clarifies it, makes it, it pulls it out of the actual document. It makes a very clear user-friendly chart as an exhibit versus having to slog through all those provisions in the declaration. Same thing for ACC guidelines. If you want to include them with the declaration, most of the time associations have them separate, entirely separate from the covenants, and a standalone documents that the board or the ACC can then amend themselves over time to meet the requirements of the community, or reflect the needs of the community as they age. So I would say the ARC guidelines would be better to be separate from the declaration so that you can be flexible with the changes in the community. What if your community does not have a kiosk for posting a physical notice? Ask me that question afterwards, Michelle, because that's kind of outside of the amendment provision or amendment class. On updating design and architectural guidelines, if the declarations state that the ARC committee may amend, update design guidelines, ARC rules with the advice of the board of directors, does this mean that the board must approve prior to publishing it to the community in the documents? If it just says that the ARC may amend the design ARC guidelines or rules with the advice, that just means exactly what it says. The board can advise it, but it doesn't say approval. So I would say, I don't want to look at those documents, but if it doesn't say approval, then the board doesn't have to approve it. If a board is reviewing their declarations, could they add a clause along the lines of monthly assessments? I'm going to just go for a couple minutes more, and then I'm going to have Sean print out these questions, the rest of them that I didn't get to, and I'll try to get to it in some follow-up email. So if a board is reviewing their declarations, could they add a clause along the lines of monthly assessments can be of no more than 2% of the value of the unit most recently sold? So you can pretty much add almost, whatever you want to, that's not against state law. So you can add a provision that says exactly like that, exactly what you said. However, just because you can add something that way doesn't mean it might be a good thing to do or a good reason to do it. You might want to talk to your attorney about specifics of the goals of it and why it might not be a good idea. So you can pretty much draft whatever assessment language you want in there, because the statute doesn't really cap it or say you must do it this way, but please talk to your attorney about whether it's a good idea to do that. One more, if your covenants are old, but you have a new collection policy drawn up by a lawyer, meeting current laws, does it supersede? So it doesn't supersede to the extent of those provisions that are deferred to the declaration. So for example, state law says the collection policy must include late fees and interest. And then you write it to include late fees and interest, or the collection policy, sorry, may include late fees and interest, because that's what Kiowa says. You can include late fees and interest if you want to. And so you include late fees and interest, but your declaration says no late fees are allowed. Well, then you can't include late fees, because the requirement in your declaration that says no late fees are allowed is not superseded by the statute, because the statute doesn't require you to have late fees. Hopefully that makes sense, because it's going to depend on the collection policy and whether the changes you have made are contrary to the declaration and whether those changes are not addressed by the statutory requirements. So it gets tricky when it comes to statute versus declaration, because statute defers in many cases to the declaration, bylaws, and articles. Okay, it's 1:15, so I'm going to go ahead and stop now. But I apologize again for the mishap in the beginning. I'm going to try to get all these questions printed out so I can answer the rest of them and maybe send out an email blast. I do have a couple of things that I'm going to send out to you anyway after this class, some follow-ups, a checklist of whether or not your documents are good, bad, or ugly, and other information that might help you with respect to documents. But I appreciate so much that you were with us today, and that hopefully you'll come back and attend some of our other classes. But I'm going to go ahead and sign off now. And again, thank you. And I hope to see you in future webinars. And thanks for all the questions too.